Hello, everybody! Back at it again, it is RaspberryBeryl. I hope you all can hear me. Let me check. I always have to check first to make sure the microphone is working, and it's tedious. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another stream for today. Today, we'll be reading another couple chapters of the fanfic called Sunsets and Freedom. We read the first two chapters last time we streamed this Minecraft reading. It wasn't last week because I was sick last week, but the week before that. So we're back on to continue reading this fanfic, if you haven't already gone off and read it by yourself. Okay, let me see. And I think I have everything I need. I was having a couple errors with the stream earlier, so forgive me if I need to just take a break quickly or, you know, stop suddenly to make sure the stream is still healthy. We were having a lot of errors there at the beginning leading up, so I hope everything is okay. And also, I told you guys last stream, but I just got some braces, and so it's a little hard to talk, but I'm gonna try. It's very funny. Okay. So let's just dive right into it. And we don't have anything prepared for you to look at, so you'll just be staring at this screen for the most part and listening to me reading. Maybe one day I'll get like a little book set up or a desk that I can set up to make things look a little more interesting. But yeah, the point's to listen to me read anyways, so whatever. Okay, please forgive me if I stutter, hesitate, or mispronounce anything, and for any noises in the background. Let's begin. Sunsets and Freedom, Chapter 3, Liar, Liar. Tommy jumped at the sudden voice, only to see Tubbo's head peeking out from the fire escape. He frowned, almost horrified that he even found him. He had only shown Tubbo this place once, and yet somehow managed to get back here without an issue. Not only that, but he said found you, meaning that he had been looking for him, specifically looking for him here. Tubbo managed to get onto the roof in the time Tommy took to even process that he was really there when a second person emerged from the fire escape. Not only did Tubbo track him down and find him, he brought at least one other person with him. I figured I'd find you here, Tubbo exclaimed like he hadn't shaken Tommy to his very core. Since he'd been out of the compound, he hadn't seen anyone he met twice. For a variety of reasons. I can't say that word, I'm sorry guys. But no one's ever tried to find him again. Only the compound. But Tubbo and whoever his friend was couldn't be from the compound. It was very obvious when it came to looks alone. There was no way. Plus, Tubbo was allowed his ID card. Tommy hadn't seen his in ages, and it wasn't even sure if the compound still had it. Tommy didn't even know if he knew the correct name for his power, although he knew it was he knew it sure as hell wasn't what they called him. Tommy trailed off, not quite knowing what to do next. He actually interacted with people his age so much, he assumed the other person was also Tubbo's age, based on the way he'd held himself and positioned himself behind Tubbo. Despite the fact that he was literally huge and taller than Tommy himself. He was used to using his height as his advantage, but this time he couldn't do that. Gosh, he really didn't want to skip town, so his powers were a no-go. He hesitated before looking down at the ground, wondering how far down the jump was, and if it would kill him. Well, he knew it wouldn't kill him. He had jumped off before, down into the dumpster. Hitting garbage was never pleasant, but he almost always ended up uninjured. Everything had its limits, but as a general rule, jumping into a dumpster, as long as they were full, was probably the best bet. This view is nice, even if it isn't sunset, Tubbo told him. Thanks, Tommy replied, tightening the straps of his backpack. Oh, sorry, Tommy, this is Ranbu. He's my friend. Ranbu gave him a slight wave, although he looked a little uncomfortable to be there. Hello, Tommy rasped out, still slightly stunned by the events taking place. Mind if we stay? Ranbu asked quietly. Tommy could tell he was shy, at least around new people. Tommy looked down at the dumpster again. He could try to calculate the distance and the amount of damage he would take, but he wasn't very good at math in general. Math wasn't quite his strength. In fact, academics weren't his strength. He hadn't been to school before. He was just lucky he was taught how to read. The compound wasn't about raising children so much as it was creating weapons. Unfortunately, they weren't very good at either. That fall would probably kill you, Tubbo said, glancing at the way down and shaking Tommy from his thoughts. Tubbo sat down, a little bit closer to Tommy than he would have liked, but still a good ways away. Touch would not be great right now. Tommy shrugged. That was debatable. Clearly, Tubbo hadn't jumped off as many buildings as Tommy had. Jumped is an overstatement, more like fell or was being chased or misstepped. Probably not, Tommy answered. Maybe break a couple of things, but dying isn't likely. Not from this height, at least. He sat down as well. He had been walking and standing all day. It'd be nice to relax and sit down, even if it was just for a minute. You sound like you speak from experience, Ranbu said, also sitting, pretty close to Tubbo, still angled slightly behind him, although he seemed to be getting at least a little more comfortable with the situation. He could speak for himself, though. Tommy was still very uncomfortable and concerned about this situation. I do, Ranboob, Tommy replied confidently. Ha! Tubbo exclaimed, but slapped a hand over his mouth. I didn't mean to laugh, but come on, that was good. Ranbu frowned, spluttering a little at a bit at the nickname. Apparently, neither of them had heard that one before. It was obvious. It's just adding another B to your name. Tommy rolled his eyes. You aren't all too clever, are you? Tubbo had stopped laughing and scrunched up his nose. I'd say I was pretty clever yesterday, Tubbo replied, sticking his tongue out. Ah, yes, Tommy Fake agreed. Slamming your head against the metal fire escape was totally clever. Tommy rolled his eyes. You are going to kill yourself one day. I don't care if you're indestructible. You're going to die if you keep doing things like that. Ranbu muttered, looking a little bit more concerned than mad. Tubbo waved him off, not even bothering to actually answer Ranbu's comment. Tommy was inclined to agree with him. I got the fire escape loose, didn't I? Tubbo taunted. Blah. Plus, on our way up here, I seem to recall that it was in perfect working order. Tommy glared at him, although it was a lot more playful than he thought it would be. Just because it worked doesn't mean it was clever, Tommy replied. Tubbo scoffed. You scared the piss out of you. I scared the piss out of you. I'd call that a completely clever. Tubbo tilted his head with a smirk. Tommy threw his head back and groaned. It's not every day that you see someone slam their head as hard as they can against a solid metal and not die, or at least get a frickin' bad concussion, Tommy exclaimed in reply. Yeah, I have to agree with that. I've seen you jump on a live grenade before, and I would still freak out if you banged your head against a fire escape, Ranbu cut in. You've jumped onto a live grenade? Tommy asked, a little more to himself than to Tubbo, but Tubbo practically ignored him, not giving Tommy an answer, nor did he even acknowledge that he spoke. I'll be fine. It's literally my thing. I am fine, Tubbo replied. You're going to get yourself killed, Ranbu answered. You're going to get yourself killed, Tubbo mocked. I am indestructible. Piss off. If he dies, do you guys know a necromancer so we can say, I told you so? Because that'd be Pog, Tommy replied. Ranbu gave a so-so motion with his hand. Necromancer? No. Talk to the dead? Yes, Ranbu answered. Tommy thought for a moment. First off, weird stuff. He didn't think he'd get anything remotely close to a yes. Who the hell were these people? It'll do, Tommy answered finally, deciding to at least continue with his conversation. Just gotta tell him that he was wrong. You know, despite the fact that you're both against me right now, I would literally do the same thing, so I can't even be mad about it, Tubbo said, nodding slightly. I know, Ranbu said. You've asked to do something similar. Tubbo shrugged. I had told him, hey, he had a frickin' gun. Let me go first. I'm indestructible. And he said, you're a kid. Shut the frick up. And then got shot, Tubbo said. I'm not going to apologize for asking to tell him off a little bit. I'm not even going to try to understand any of that or even bother to try to process it like a normal person instead ask, how do you know someone who can talk to dead people? Tommy asked. Work, they replied simultaneously. Tommy raised an eyebrow. That sounded practiced. Ranbu made the so-so motion again. Kinda, we're supposed to answer questions like that with work, but to that question specifically, nah, we've actually know them through work. What do you guys do? Apparently it involves guns and grenades, yet having no knowledge about what is cop show fiction and what is reality, Tommy replied, still not over the fact that Tubbo thought that he could knock the latter down with a simple rock. Not fair. I thought I saw another one of our co-workers do something similar, so shut the frick up, Tubbo muttered, pouting a bit. That's just Tubbo, Ranbu said, and it's a private business. I actually don't know what the actual title is or what we technically do, but I get paid and housed and fed for free, so I really don't care. What if they make you murder people? Will you care then? Tommy countered, just to be a little bit. He couldn't help it all that much. Tubbo replied. Ranbu cuffed him lightly in the back of the head. First of all, they wouldn't. Not to me. If they did, it'd be for a really good reason. Like people will die or something if I didn't. Plus, there would be literally no other option, Ranbu replied, calmly, a little too calm for Tommy's liking. He shifted a little bit, sort of further from the both of them, hoping they wouldn't notice. No other option was something he heard before, many times. So many frickin' times. A couple of times he probably wasn't even meant to hear it. No other option, and now he was alone, so he shifted a little further away from the other two. Sounds kind of fricked up, Tommy told him, hoping his voice was normal. Both Ranbu and Tubbo noticed him shifting away once Ranbu told him about killing. They probably scared him with that, thinking that their jobs revolved around the death of others. Okay, that wasn't completely false, but a lot of the time they weren't the ones who had to kill the people. We don't kill people, Tubbo told him. If anyone dies, it's usually not our fault, and hardly ever intentional. Tubbo tried his best to not lie to Tommy and also make him comfortable, although he was trying to soften the wrong thing. At this point, Tommy was pretty desensitized when people killed each other. It was hard, but it happened a little too often for Tommy's liking. far too often, and he was simply used to it at this point. Sure, it sucked and it was unhealthy, but it wasn't up to him. No, it wasn't death. It was the no other way. Another way, this or that. There was and always would be another way, as long as he had anything to say about it. "Why are you here?" Tommy asked shortly. He enjoyed their banter. It was fun, even if it was just a short amount of time. He hadn't interacted with kids his age in forever, but he had to ask. He had to know. "Why did you lie?" Tubbo replied. Tommy frowned, thinking about it. What point could he have lied? The buildings weren't quite a lie. Okay, sure, he didn't live there now, but on his first days in the city he had, before he was kicked out, that is. "I asked you first," Tommy said. Sure, he was being childish, but he didn't care. He asked first. "I wanted to see you again," Tubbo answered softly. That was also not a lie. Tubbo wanted to help Tommy first and foremost. He related to him and he was really great company. Not to mention he cursed when Ronbu wouldn't. He liked that. "Why did you lie?" "Why do you care?" Tommy replied. "Why would you care if I lied about where I lived? Why does it matter?" His tone was clipped and obviously much more shut off than just a couple of minutes ago. Had he even been open then? "Because I want to help," Tubbo yelled back, getting pretty frustrated. Ronbu knew Tubbo's yells. He didn't particularly like how fast Tubbo was getting annoyed, but he knew that stepping in wouldn't do anything good right now. Help? He wants to help. Yeah, he wants to help, just like the compound wanted to help. Just like the compound was helping him by taking his only friend. Just like that dang compound. These people faced real threats, and who was to say they weren't from the compound themselves? Surely that had more than one base. Tubbo and Ronbu would be spies that wanted to capture Tommy. Well, he didn't particularly blame them. Punishments were always bad. He spent months trying to get the frick out of there, and he wasn't going to go back now. Punishments be darned. They could survive the punishments. Tommy wasn't sure he could survive his if he went back. Though, he always said he was irreplaceable. Okay, so maybe they wouldn't kill him, but they would sure as hell beat the stuff out of him for at least a year for this. Probably break his legs too, to make sure he couldn't run again. Maybe drug him up since he needed to walk to do his job correctly. He should have known better, and now he had to skip town again. Great. Frick, he'd go west this time. He had been consistently going north this whole time, and the compound probably thought he'd continue like that, especially since they had caught up to him. West sounded good right now. New places to explore, and new strange rules he'd have to get used to. They wanted to help. Help in Tubbo's voice echoed through his head. He wasn't going to let them take him again. He was glad he grabbed his backpack. He had left it a couple times, despite the fact that he was afraid of getting stolen. He had never been more glad he had grabbed it. There was no way he was going back to his house now. He'd just straight up start walking west and hope for the best. Hey, that rhymed. Instead of gracing either of them with an answer to that, he turned and walked straight off the building and down into the dumpster below. He was lucky it was trash day tomorrow, and the dang thing was full. The last thing Tubbo had expected when he yelled at Tommy was that he wanted to help, was for Tommy to shut down instantly. It made him wonder if he had yelled the wrong thing. Tommy's face was now devoid of all emotion, and he paused for a minute. Tubbo blinked, but was unwilling to say anything. It was like Tommy was rebooting or something. The fact that Tommy could barely process the fact that Tubbo wanted to help was terrifying, and the implications were pretty bad. He turned to Ronbu, wondering what to do, but only saw him studying Tommy. He was concerned too. Tubbo could tell. Tommy had suddenly snapped out of it, like a switch inside of his head had been flipped. But again, he managed to surprise Tubbo by not only refusing to reply, but then walking off the edge of the building. Tubbo couldn't help but cry out and rushed over to the edge, Ronbu right beside him. Tommy was fine though. He had landed in a dumpster, which he had to have known it was there. By the time the two of them got to the edge of the building, however, Tommy had already vaulted over the side of the dumpster and had started walking down the street. "Dang it," Tubbo muttered, preparing to jump down as well. Ronbu's hand on his shoulder stopped him. "What?" Tubbo asked, looking up at his friend. Can I handle this one?" Ronbu asked. I think I may know what to do." Tubbo frowned, but nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, trusting that Ronbu knew what he was doing. "Worst comes to worst, yell and teleport yourself anywhere. I don't care how far. Ranbu smiled lightly at him and nodded before teleporting off the building himself. Tubbo smiled as well, more of a proud one rather than a happy one. Ranbu was still getting used to using his powers, but teleporting himself was easiest. On good days, Ranbu could teleport himself anywhere, but Tubbo heavily appreciated this. Ranbu wasn't quite sure which way Tommy had gone. He knew the general direction, but where from there? Ranbu couldn't be sure. He paused in his own tracks and took a breath. What would he have done? He hadn't been like that in a while, but what would he have done in this situation? Alleyways, dark ones, tight ones. That way he'd be less likely to be seen and caught. He could work with that. He jogged looking through the maze of buildings and alleyways before finding the nearest alley that fit Ranbu's image. It was every stereotypical alleyway that you could see in movies. It was damp and Ranbu felt slightly trapped when he walked into it. But he knew that this is where he would be if he had just escaped. Perhaps Tommy hadn't just escaped or even escaped at all, but Ranbu had his suspicions. He learned to trust his gut. From his own experience and from his time working under Techno, his gut feeling was strong. Ranbu would not consider himself a brave person. Sure, he wasn't a coward, but brave was a strong word. Tubbo would disagree, and maybe he was right, but Ranbu wasn't sure. Despite this and the anxiety he was feeling while he walked, he continued down the alleyway. He was walking slightly faster than he normally would. 1, to catch up with Tommy, and 2, he didn't want to be there any longer than necessary. Luckily, he caught sight of a bright red just ahead of him. Tommy. It had to be. His shirt was the only thing that bright of red that Ranbu had seen in this part of town. He hurried forward, trying his best to catch up. Tommy had a huge head start, and Ranbu would not want to lose him now. The things that were considered lucky depended on who things were affecting. This was good for Ranbu, lucky even, but probably bad for Tommy. By the time he caught up to him, Tommy had noticed he was being followed and started to run, but he didn't realize he was backing himself into a corner, or a dead end really. There was nowhere else for him to go. This was probably not the best idea. For all Ranbu knew, Tommy could react like a caged animal. Ranbu was just decently good at hand-to-hand combat, but he had no clue how good Tommy was, let alone what his powers were. Today had been a good day so far, so if all else failed, he'd just teleport to the main street again. Hopefully not in the street and get hit by a car, but small victories here. Tommy turned around to face Ranbu, and it was strange how he looked more understanding than mad or anything. Tommy took off the gloves he was wearing, stuffing them into his pockets and glaring at Ranbu. He might have been reacting like a caged animal, and Ranbu wasn't sure if he could handle an attack from Tommy. Can I tell you something? Ranbu asked. The situation was entirely out of his league. He had just chased the kid through alleyways, and then cornered him only to ask if he could tell him something. This was weird. Go ahead, Tommy replied, clearly not relaxing. I think I know what it's like, Ranbu muttered. I'm not sure, not 100% anyway, but I think I know why you're scared, or why you run away. Tommy raised an eyebrow at him. Go on, Tommy replied, cautiously. I was in a containment center once, Ranbu told him. Tommy blinked and seemingly relaxed, even if just slightly. I was like 8 when I went in, and got rescued at 13. 5 years is a long time, Tommy muttered. Ranbu shrugged before seemingly remembering something. Ranbu quickly grabbed his ID from his pocket. Tommy flinched when he held it out to him. Tommy looked from Ranbu to the card, but instead of taking it, he just stepped closer to look at it. He could help his jaw drop when he read it. You're S level like Tubbo? Tommy whispered. Yeah, teleportation of anything, anyone, anywhere. I'm not great at it since I was contained from the early years of power development, but I'm getting better, Ranbu commented happily. I'm guessing you were contained too? Tommy hesitated. Something like that, Tommy muttered. The compound wasn't a containment center. To do that, they'd have to, well, contain people. While they technically did that, they also used them, so containment center wasn't the right word. It was just the compound. He was pretty sure the compound was slightly worse than a containment center. He couldn't be sure, though. I was the only S level. Well, obviously there were a few of us. It's a miracle that Tubbo and I even met each other, Ranbu muttered. What level are you? If you were in a containment unit, they must have deemed you dangerous. Tommy resisted the urge to shudder. I don't know, he muttered. It was a lie. But that didn't matter. He wasn't sure if he liked whatever the hell this company Tubbo and Rambu worked for. They were obviously involved in some sort of kind of violence. Tommy had enough violence for the rest of his life. Well, enough for a long time anyway. What? Rambu wondered out loud. Everyone knew their level. It was something assigned anywhere from the ages of 2 to 10, depending on where your powers emerged. S through B levels were considered dangerous since they were really powerful, and so few people were that high on the scale. There hadn't been S levels for centuries until recently. There were a few now. The exact number was iffy, at least to Tommy. He wasn't sure how many there were anymore. I don't know, Tommy repeated a little louder. Lying before you truly know a person was probably the safest bet for someone like Tommy. They could do literally anything to him. At least he knew that Rambu wasn't with the compound. They only held 2 people in their building. Well, now they didn't hold anyone. Can I see your ID? Rambu asked, shifting nervously. Can you not read it or something? Rambu knew that if Tommy was A-level and presented early, he could have never learned to read. They weren't great about education in those places, just enough to keep you alive and never enough to let you live. I hadn't seen it myself for years. I'm lucky if I remember what little it told me in the first place. I know my name. For all I care, that's all I really need to know. Tommy knew his level. After all, it was drilled into his head, even before the compound. He remembered a nice voice softly telling him. It sucked, but he was reduced to nothing but his number. He was glad he didn't have his ID anymore. Nobody could reduce him to his level ever again. Oh, Rambu said. He was always validated by his ID. He liked having it. Whenever he started doubting himself, he would look at the bright shiny golden S on his card and he felt better, even if it was only for a little bit. The S told him he was powerful and special, even if it didn't feel like it. He wasn't too sure why someone would hate it unless they were low level, but Tommy didn't even have a clue about what level he was. How long had he been in a containment? Probably longer than Rambu, although Rambu was consistently reminded of his status as an S level based on the fact that he was in complete isolation. It was a rough 5 years. Yeah, Tommy replied, his arms crossed. I know that the containment centers always say things like they're trying to help, and they always have and they might have even told your family that, but we actually want to help you. It's pretty obvious to us that you don't have an actual home or regular meals. Tommy shifted uncomfortably. Both Rambu and Tubbo had noticed the signs that he was probably homeless. Tubbo had once been really close to homelessness and knew that Tommy was lying about his home. It's why they knew they shouldn't look for him at his home and left it for the others. Tommy would have been scared off by them. It was good that they did this way. Okay, I'm doing pretty good on my own, Tommy told him, shifting again. He was clearly uncomfortable with this, but they couldn't just let him stay here on his own. He wasn't going to make it like that forever, especially if he was still on the run from the containment centers. Things would never get better. He'd probably be trapped in one as long as he was alone on the streets. I don't doubt that, but Tommy, you're going to get in some kind of trouble that you can't get out of one day. We won't let anyone else take you to a center or anything. We have resources and we take down containment centers. They are the people that rescued me. I've stayed with them ever since. You'll be fine if you come with us. We won't make you do anything you don't want to, and we won't hurt you, I promise. Tommy seemingly perked up at that. He thought about it for a moment. You have resources? Tommy asked quietly. Rambu nodded. Yep, people, computers, food, water, shelters, anything you'll find. Anything and you'll be fine, Rambu told him. Do you want to at least meet people and check it out? I promise things sound better than they are. You may even get close to new people. I got a sister out of this, and I got to meet another S level. Tubbo and I have gotten really close. We are great friends now, Rambu told him. Just come with us. No one will hurt me. I won't be taken anywhere I don't want to, Tommy said, his voice shaking a little more than he would have liked. Nope, and I can teleport you back to me if I really try. I promise you'll be fine. Tommy was quiet for a minute. Okay, he finally said. I'll try it. Rambu smiled. Cool. Could you lead us back to the main road? I'm not sure which way it is. Tommy paused and looked at him before cackling. A real nice laugh that Rambu wouldn't help but smile at. Yeah, Rambu. Just follow me. Maybe I'll just call Puns. If anybody can track that kid down, it's him, Wilbur said. He owes me a favor anyway. No, Tubbo exclaimed. I'm telling you, Rambu is going to come back and bring him back. After Rambo had followed Tommy, Tubbo had gone back to the group and told them what was going on. I have to agree with him, mate, Phil told Wilbur. Punz isn't the person I would call to deal with kids. If Tommy isn't scared off by us, he will be by Punz, and we'll probably never see him again. Whatever, Wilbur huffed. How long do we wait before we go in and help him? Just a couple more minutes, Wilbur. I'm sure Rambo can help bring him back. Tommy's probably been in a containment center, and the only one of us that's been there is Rambo. He's the only one who can relate to him right now, Tubbo huffed. Can you have patience, Wilbur? Techno teased his twin. Wilbur stuck his tongue out at him in reply, like the natural, mature adult he was. And how are we back on the main road? Tommy exclaimed. This is literally a maze. I have no clue how I found you in the first place, Rambo huffed. It's not that hard, it's just a bunch of squares. They interconnect, Tommy shrugged. The two noticed the group staring at them, and they both stopped, neither in willing to talk too much. That's Tommy, I told you Rambo could do it, Tubbo exclaimed, smiling and waving at the two of them. Hi, Tommy replied quietly. And that is the end of Chapter 3. And I think we have time for at least one more chapter. Let me get some water quickly. Gosh, it's been quite a while since I actually read this story. This being like the first fanfic that I actually read. And oh, I remember I'm just all the flashbacks I'm getting right now, all the good memories of reading this for the first time and being in Annex's Discord server for the other fanfics they made. Great times. Okay, Chapter 4. I think that's wrong, but I don't know enough about you to counter, so I'll just sit down and shut up. Trigger warnings: child abuse, non-consensual drug use, scars, mentions of trauma, mentions of suicide and hanging. No one does anything. Okay, let us begin. The car ride to headquarters was surprisingly quiet. They thought he would have spoken at least a little bit, maybe to Tubbo and Rambo only, but he was dead quiet. Tubbo, being the smartest, was sat in the middle of Rambo and Tommy. They were very glad they hadn't taken only one car, especially since they wouldn't have been able to fit everyone in one car. 6 people, 7 counting Quackity, but he wouldn't have come if they took one car. One would require someone. They took one car. It would have required someone to sit in the trunk. Techno had already offered Wilbur to be that one, but they took 2 cars. It probably would have made more sense if they were split 3 and 4 in each car, but they thought it was a bad idea to separate the kids, and it was also a bad idea to have no adult supervision. Quackity absolutely did not count for the adult supervision, so Technoblade was stuck with the kids, and Quackity. Probably best. Both Tommy and Quackity were more afraid of Techno than anything else. Neither would try anything, in case they were thinking about it, as long as Techno was in the car. Tommy was still in his vow of silence or whatever, but he refused to talk. Maybe not intentionally, but he hadn't spoken a word since he greeted them, only nodding or shaking his head if he was asked any questions. He stared quietly out the window, watching as the slums turned into the middle class and further into the more wealthy neighborhoods. It was definitely a cultural shock, and the buildings became bigger and much more well-made. There were little, if any, cracks in the buildings. The windows weren't boarded up, and central air was much more common than seeing battered up ACs in the windows. It was probably very interesting for a street kid. But Tommy, despite looks and the fact that they found him there, didn't seem like a street kid. His attitude and his brains and the way that Tubbo had spoken about him, he didn't seem like a normal street kid. And he was familiar, to Techno at least, just something about the kid. It was familiar and Techno didn't like it one bit, because he clearly hadn't ever met him before. Techno didn't deal with kids. That was Wilbur's and Phil's job. How he ended up with Ranbu as his apprentice, he doubted he'd ever know. Although the quiet was a nice change of pace for literally everyone in the car, that Techno knew anyway, it was strange. There was an obvious tension somewhere between the people in the car. Tommy was absolutely uncomfortable and not trusting whatever was going on. Strangely enough, he seemed to relax when he saw that there were a lot more people. Most of the time, street kids were afraid when they noticed that they were horribly outnumbered. by a bunch of adults as well. There was only 2 kids out of the 6 of them, and they were both S level. Not that Tommy knew, but Techno and Wilbur were twins, A levels, whose powers complemented each other really well. Apparently all twins were like that, but very few were as powerful as those 2. They could basically figure out anything with just the two of them. Despite the fact that he didn't know anyone but Tubbo's, Ranbu's, and Phil's powers, Phil had wings. It wasn't hard to guess. Tommy seemed to relax into the group. Strength in numbers, he guessed. Although, what he wouldn't give to know what Tommy was thinking right then about then. Tommy was hungry and focusing very hard on not letting his stomach make any noise. It was embarrassing for a loud grumble to sound off in the middle of the otherwise silent car. He guessed that eating that granola bar was a bad idea, since he ate something that his stomach had wanted more. He didn't have any more, although if these people were truthful about wanting to help him and having resources, because then he could actually eat. He missed eating. In the compound, he was given at least 1 meal daily, unless it was a punishment. He normally had 3 meals. It was the only thing he regretted leaving behind, that and his friend, but he was taken away a long time before Tommy left. Escaping with the both of them was hard. It's why they never did it. He was definitely uncomfortable being alone with these people, especially Technoblade. Who named their kid that? He was the kind of guy Tommy would usually steer clear of, especially if he saw him on the streets. He was too tall and too muscular. He would be a bad person to get on the wrong side of. Tommy liked Wilbur though. His voice was calming, soothing almost. It was familiar but not in the way like the compound. Perhaps like his parents were once, but he didn't remember them. Phil seemed nice. He was calm and clearly in charge, so Tommy opted to stay away from him as well. He stuck to Rambu's side a little bit more than Tubbo's, only because Rambu probably knew what Tommy was feeling. Not the same way, of course. No, Rambu was free from his captors when he was rescued. Tommy was still on the run, technically speaking. While there was no way the compound knew where he was, there was still a chance they could come to his city and find him. It would be completely accidental, but still possible. Rambu's captors were still behind bars, and while there were still plenty of people out there who believed S-level should be contained, and there was no way that Rambu's center was the last one, Tommy's were still actively looking for him. Although he knew he was at least safe from the compound here, there was no way the compound would work with this many people. What they were doing was heavily illegal, and the more people involved, the more likely it would get back to the police, or the government. He had only counted 5 people that came by ever, one of which took away his friend, probably forever, but there were 6 different people there, none of which he'd ever seen at the compound. This was good. It meant that Rambu was probably telling the truth, which meant, at the very least, he could trust both Rambu and Tubbo. Plus, it had been a while since he truly interacted with kids his age. Or ever, really. He hadn't ever properly interacted with anyone his age before. Strange. Tubbo was confused, or curious at the very least. Tommy wasn't wearing gloves, although he kept his hands either under his thighs or kept his arms crossed. It was almost like he wanted them back, but refused to put them back on. But he had them still. Tubbo could see them sticking out of his pockets, but he wasn't wearing them. He had 2 different pairs as well, a pair of fingerless gloves, the ones he was wearing when he first met, and the full ones, the ones he had been wearing up until he and Rambu came back. But why would he take them off, only to be uncomfortable when they were back off? It just didn't seem right to him. Maybe he was trying to make a good first impression. Tubbo had no idea what Rambu had told him, but he assumed that it was at least a little about the company and how they were probably going to make Tommy at least for a little bit, as long as he needed it anyway. About how they were going to take Tommy in, at least for a little bit anyway. Phil hoped the other car was doing well. Him and Wilbur were sitting in a tense relative silence. The occasional comment here and there. The kid was clearly a lot like Rambu. He had the same demeanor as Rambu, especially when he had first gotten out. He hadn't touched anyone in fear of teleporting them by accident. Rambu had been a relatively late bloomer when it came to his powers, getting them around 6 or 8, especially for S level. They tended to present early. No non-S level presented at age 2. The earliest in A level was at age 3. The average age was around 4 or 5, but anywhere between 2 and 10. The powers would present. Ranbu had lived in a semi-normal life beforehand, but he remembered very little. Before they found out he really couldn't control his powers, especially then, they used to keep him drugged up. Not enough to get him addicted or make him sick, but enough to make his memory or life before the containment center was foggy at best and completely gone at worst. Luckily for whoever put Ranbu in the containment center, whether it be his parents or his foster system, Ranbu didn't remember them. Otherwise, they would have gotten more than an earful from the entirety of SBI and Nikki. Technically, their entire company was SBI, but the original members were the only ones referred to as SBI. Call it a family thing. Do you think he'll mesh well, fit in? Wilbur asked suddenly, knocking Phil out of his own head. He glanced at Wilbur and let out a breath. Ranbu did, Phil answered. It wasn't a real answer, and it very clearly not what Wilbur was looking for, especially based on the glare he was giving Phil. I know you'd say something like that, Wilbur grumbled, pouting like a child. Phil chuckled slightly, keeping his eyes on the road. No powers on family or friends, Phil hummed half-heartedly, not particularly caring if Wilbur used his powers on him or anyone else for that matter. We're not in the house, Wilbur pointed out helpfully, therefore powers are fair game. Fair enough, Phil replied. What am I going to do next? Wilbur paused for a moment, looking at Phil before slumping down in his seat. Swerve the car back and forth. Phil chuckled at Wilbur's bored tone. He didn't swerve the car, though he had been planning on it. If Wilbur had waited any longer to start talking again, he would have tried to get his attention or a conversation going that way. Good, Phil told him, getting ready to turn down to their building. I see you ditching training hasn't affected your abilities all too much. Wilbur's ears flushed red as he knew he had been caught, probably since the beginning, knowing Phil. Well, since I'm so good, I don't need to continue training, Wilbur huffed. Training your powers is good and incredibly healthy. I understand it's easy for you to skip training and still use your powers a healthy amount, but not everyone can. Think of the kind of example you'll be giving Tubbo and Ranbu, and now Tommy. They're young and impressionable. 2 of them have probably been taught never to use their powers. It's best to show them that their powers, whatever Tommy's may be, are good and nothing to be ashamed of. Wilbur was silent for a bit, simply staring at the road ahead of them, and Phil sort of wished he had Wilbur's powers right about then. That was such a dad speech, Wilbur finally whined after a full minute of utter silence. Phil couldn't help but bark of laughter that he let out. Wilbur was great at that. They really should have spent more time together. Well, I sure hope so. Otherwise, I must be a pretty bad dad to you and Techno, Phil offered after he finished laughing. Dadza, Wilbur whispered. Did he open up in the car? Phil asked Techno quietly as Tommy was distracted by Tubbo shoving him the building. Techno shook his head in reply. No, not at all. He hasn't even said a word. Not even to Tubbo or Ranbu, Techno told him and Wilbur. To be fair, neither of them had said anything either, but still. He doesn't trust us, Phil sighed. Unless we're the ones who rescued them, containment kids rarely do, Wilbur replied. If we're going to keep him, whether it be for work reasons or otherwise, it's going to be a long journey. Ranbu was pretty good, Techno muttered. We were the ones who rescued him, Wilbur deadpanned. And he was S level while we had Tubbo. The higher they are, the closer their relationship, Techno finished. The higher the level of a person, the more likely that their relationship with someone of their same level would be a close one. It's why so many people believe S level should be separated. They could become really close and their combined powers could spell danger. But we have no clue what level Tommy is. It's true, he could be an F level. We literally don't know any F levels, Wilbur said. If he was F level, he wouldn't have been in a containment unit, Phil commented. We're not sure if he is actually a containment kid. We're just assuming because Ranbu thinks so. Ranbu hasn't told us what his conversation with Tommy was like. We'll have to wait until the kid is asleep or until we're alone with Ranbu to be sure, Techno said. Are you coming or are we going to give Tommy the tour? Tubbo called out. They looked at the group of kids. Apparently Quackity had left. He was only supposed to be their driver anyway. Tommy had situated himself between the 2 other kids, clearly more comfortable where the adults weren't next to him. Even if Tommy hadn't been in a containment unit, he was obviously traumatized. by adults considering that he hadn't trusted them. His hands were on tight around his backpack straps. It probably held all his personal belongings, anything that he cared about anyway. He seriously didn't seem to trust anyone here right now. They hoped that wouldn't last too long. The place was huge, the biggest place Tommy had ever been in, so much bigger than the compound. The compound was mainly underground, composed of 5 layers of floors, 4 below ground and 1 above. This place had well over 5 floors, and that was just above ground. There was no telling how many floors were under it. "This is headquarters, and also home for many of us," Wilbur exclaimed, rather theatrically. "For many of us?" Tommy questioned, surprising the adults. Yes, the majority of the people actually involved in SBI live here. The top 3 floors are living spaces and other more domestic things, while the rest are more work and professional spaces," Wilbur managed. He hadn't expected the kid to ask questions, especially not after what sounded like the most awkward car ride in existence. Tommy, on the other hand, only nodded. "I live on the second to the top floor with my dad. We're in the apartment labeled 204, Tubbo told Tommy. "I live with Nikki on the third to top floor," Rambo added, a little quieter and less excited than Tubbo had. Tommy nodded again at the information given to him, not saying anything else. "If you follow us, we'll give you a short tour and hopefully get a little more familiar," Phil said. He didn't say anything, but he had at least spoken to them. It was the small things. The inside of the building seemed so professional. To be honest, Tommy hadn't ever been in a building like this before. The only ones he's been in were the compound, an apartment building, and crumbling ones. Hey, he hadn't even been out for a year, only about 5 months. His year free of an actual companion was coming up. He should get a medal or something, although he doubted that going back to the compound and asking for one would do him any good. They certainly wouldn't give him a medal, probably just imprison him again. Ew. The floors were tile and clean. It was noisy and yet quiet. People weren't talking, not anything above a polite whisper, but there was still noise. Shoes against the tile, keyboards typing, elevators dinging. The noise of existence. Tommy found it comforting. It wasn't quiet like the compound, and it wasn't as noisy as the city outside. He liked it. It made him feel safe, protected, and yet free. This might actually be bearable. Nice, even. They were still talking. Wilbur had been doing most of it, and he seemed to like the sound of his own voice. Honestly, Tommy couldn't blame him. He spoke well, soothing. Not that he admitted it. He wasn't paying attention to what they were saying anyway. He was a little busy finding the easiest escape routes, just in case. Rambo was from a containment center, and despite having similarities, the compound was not a containment center. It was worse, or at least Tommy assumed it was. Containment centers were bad, sure, but the compound wasn't exactly a walk in the park. He had doubted most people would have made it out of there alive. He was just lucky they hadn't had leverage over him anymore. Sooner than he thought, Tommy had found himself in an elevator. Normally, fitting 6 people in a single elevator was rough. Too many people in such a small space was uncomfortable. There were plenty of elevators in this compound, and Tommy had only ever been in one with 3 people before, and even then it was cramped. However, these elevators were huge, literally. You could fit an entire king-size bed in it, or at least he assumed so. He had only seen one a few times in the mattress store in his last city. Certainly looked bigger than anything he had seen in that store. Anyway, the point was, it was a huge elevator and they weren't cramped. While Tommy could have preferred stairs, the elevator was always a risk in the compound. It was a relief to see that they wouldn't be pressed up against each other. Tommy even managed to get into a corner. No surprise, attacks would be coming his way. Tubbo was a watcher. He noticed things that people didn't always see. Sure, he was impulsive and could be reckless at times, but he was definitely observant. Which is why he was confused and curious right about now. For many reasons, Tommy had obviously been chatty when he was with Tubbo, probably because he hadn't known then that any of this was going to happen, and it was just one-on-one kids interacting with each other. It wasn't too hard to see that Tommy was probably just uncomfortable with the situation in general. Tubbo also had no clue what Rambo had said to him to get him to join them, or at least come with them. But what really had Tubbo's attention was that Tommy was lacking something this whole meeting, something that he had when he was first talking with Rambo and Tubbo earlier. His gloves were gone. He had noticed it in the car, but here it was really prominent. They were different from the ones he had been wearing when they first met, but he had always been wearing gloves whenever Tubbo saw him. He assumed that it had something to do with his powers, and the reason he had them off had something to do with the conversation with Ranbu. But he didn't know, and he certainly couldn't ask Ranbu for a while Tommy was right there. Well, Tommy, we might as well do a more proper introduction. I'm Phil. I'm kind of run this place. I started it a while ago when I adopted Techno and Wilbur. I'm sure it's not hard to see what my powers are. I'm a C level, Phil stated, then gestured for Techno and Wilbur to follow. Wilbur and Techno are A levels. Wilbur and Techno and I are A levels. I can predict others' moves before they make them in any situation except fighting, while Techno can do the same thing but opposite. He can only predict others' movements in a fight, Wilbur said. Techno nodded as if to confirm that. Well, that was useful to know. Stay away from the Wonder Twins if Tommy wanted to run. If not, he'd have to try his best to be unpredictable. That should be easy. But A levels were hard to counteract. Not that he had ever done that before, but still, it was hard. How about you? Techno asked. Obviously asking for rank and powers, Tommy simply crossed his arms and scowled at them. Wilbur was about to jump in. It was obvious from his face and how his demeanor changed from relaxed to slightly rigid, something you had to learn to recognize. Something you had to learn to recognize if you lived with him. Ranbu noticed it, with Tommy distracted and now refusing to look at anybody, opting to look at the floor instead. Ranbu made the stop motion with his hand, making sure they knew not to continue with his conversation. Pushing him may lead to unfortunate memories. Ranbu had never heard of a containment center that took ID cards. It was even more illegal than owning a containment center. Taking an ID card was one of the worst crimes, up to with murder and treason. Not to mention it was practically an unspoken agreement between everyone that it's just a line that you don't cross. In fact, it's such a big deal that no matter what, if someone's card gets taken, it makes national, sometimes international news. Tommy had his taken and it didn't, meaning he must have escaped and the center took it and it's still in operation. Who knows if Tommy even knew the technical name for his powers anymore. Maybe it wasn't as simple as Ranbu's, something like Techno and Wilbur's. Hard to name for yourself. Either way, pushing him right now would be the worst way to go. Luckily, they all caught sight of Ranbu's motion and backed off. Tommy probably would have demanded they go back down before bolting again. They wouldn't be able to find him after that, especially since Tommy seemed seasoned in the art of running away and hiding. Ranbu supposed it was useful in some ways. You don't have to answer, Phil added afterwards, hoping to calm Tommy down, at least a little bit. We were just curious. You don't have to tell us. After all, we are practically strangers. Phil smiled warmly at the end. It put most people at ease. Tommy relaxed but didn't say anything. It was an improvement, but the atmosphere was now awkward. Luckily, the elevator pitied them and they were on their floor. Well, this is our place. You'll be staying here if you like, Wilbur announced as everyone stopped out of the elevator. The elevator opened up to the living room. It was an open design. Next to the elevator doors was the kitchen and dining area, which just happened to be a counter with chairs in the kitchen. It was a modern design, mainly white and gray coloring, splashes of color shoved up here and there, showing that the apartment was definitely lived in. Yellows and blues for Wilbur, greens for Phil, and reds and pinks for Technoblade. It was very clearly lived in by those three, and no one else. Yet anyway. Here, Tommy squeaked, looking wide-eyed at the place. It was bigger than his and his friend's containment boxes back at the compound. He would know. The walls were transparent, and despite being empty, they were pretty big. Yet this place seemed impossibly bigger, and that was just the living room, not counting the bedrooms that were bound to be down the hall. Wilbur resisted the urge to snicker at Tommy's face. He'd probably shut down at that, and it was the last thing they wanted. Yeah, if you want to, mate, Phil added, smiling at the kid. Tommy nodded again, although this time probably more out of shock than refusal to talk. Do you want to go take a shower? Get changed into something more comfortable? Wilbur asked, knowing that the kid didn't smell the best. It wasn't overwhelming, but he looked clean enough. But there was only so much a kid living on the streets could do. Showering was probably pretty low down on the list of things needed to survive. He probably had to wait until it was raining. Either way, bathing was not a regular thing, and although Tommy wasn't bad or anything, it was probably best for everyone if he did shower. Apparently, Tommy agreed because he nodded enthusiastically. Wilbur smiled at him. I'll show you to your room. We'll leave you clean clothes on the bed. They'll be a bit big. I hope that's okay, Phil said. Tommy nodded. Thanks, he muttered. He had just changed his clothes, and it hadn't rained any time recently, so he hadn't gotten to wash his spare set. It was nice of them to offer new clothes. He hadn't had new clothes in a long time. Just the two he had. He had been ditched the compound uniform as soon as he could. It wasn't much, but it was a target on his back. It must be over 100 miles away now. New clothes, even ones that didn't fit, could be nice. Phil nodded at him. Of course, mate. This way. Phil led him off to the shower. The shower was heavenly. Rain was nice, but when it came to heat and the fact that he had to wear clothes when it was raining, well, made showering when it rained uncomfortable and not entirely sanitary. Maybe another time he could feel a little bad about using so much hot water, but right now he was too tired to care, let alone feel anything about it. The water had run a little darker than it should have. Despite keeping pretty clean during his time, he wasn't perfect, and his hair would continue to be dirty unless he had soap. Soap was a rare thing in Tommy's life, something he didn't get to see too often, especially not shampoo, or anything else that would help him get the dirt from his hair. It was brighter than he had last saw it. Even though it was still wet, he guessed it was dirtier than he had originally thought. It had still been obvious that he was blonde, but now it was much more like his natural hair color. His hair had always been a vibrant shade of blonde, possibly a genetics, possibly something to do with his powers, although he doubted that one. It would make more sense if his hair was brown if his powers played any part in his hair color. But he didn't remember his parents, and he definitely didn't know if powers could even affect things like hair and eye color. It's not like the compound knew, or cared to find out. Either way, Tommy was happy to have a hot shower and have alone time, no matter how short or brief, without anyone outside. Rambu had convinced him to try this out, and so far it seemed okay, but he was still wary. Containment kids were probably very gullible, especially to people who saved them. Tubbo was nice though. Nice enough. He seemed pretty trustworthy and he had a lot of fun, but he didn't know him all that well. People who were nice without a reason always had some sort of motive. It was something he learned at the compound, and it was something that continued to be proven as he made his way on the streets. People weren't just nice. There had to be something they wanted. Just another reason for Tommy to lie about his powers. His abilities were something he was used for in the past, and he didn't want a repeat of the compound. Sure, this time it would probably be a little easier, especially because it wouldn't be hard to convince at least Rambu to join him if he was going to be used. Secondly, he already done it before. He knew how to do it again. Plus, these people didn't know his powers. A surprise attack would only work in Tommy's advantage. Wilbur couldn't predict it since it was a fight, and before Techno could even activate his powers, Tommy would be attacking. Too late by then. He probably shouldn't be planning to take down the people who were offering him sanctuary, but it was better to be safe than sorry. Perhaps if he had been anyone else, the planning would have been cornered or someone or something, but it wasn't. Not to him anyway. Planning escapes and imagining things in the future was one of the things Tommy was good at. He did it a little too much in the compound, although it seemed to calm down his friend, so silver linings were good. He had dried himself off with the biggest towel he had ever seen. Then again, the ones in the compound were purposely short. It was one of the first things he was told, that they were smaller than he might have been used to, but there was a reason for that. He had to learn from his friend that it was so they wouldn't try to kill themselves with the towels. The bathroom was just one place they had privacy in the compound. It was also the most child-proofed and protected place in the entire compound. Nothing sharp, no medicine, and nothing long enough to hang yourself with. Not that Tommy ever wanted to. He was determined to get out of the compound. He couldn't say the same for his friend, even if he had never asked and his friend had never said anything. But Tommy wasn't sure if his friend was as determined as Tommy was. The clothes on the bed were definitely too big. The shirt hung off his shoulders a little bit and the pants were tied tight to stay on. But they worked and they were soft. Softer than anything Tommy had worn before. Sure, his clothes were comfortable, but they weren't this soft. These were probably pajamas. Tommy had never had pajamas, only his outside clothes and his uniform from the compound. But in the TV shows he had managed to watch, he knew that pajamas were sleeping clothes, much more comfortable than normal clothes. Tommy really felt like he could fall asleep comfortably in this. This was nice. Maybe he could actually like it here, just for a little bit anyway. Get some water quickly. So what's up with him? Techno asked Ranboo as they sat down. Phil had just come back from showing Tommy the shower and his new room for the time being. Tubbo rolled his eyes at the phrasing, but didn't say anything, probably because he wanted to know too. He's definitely a containment... Oh, sorry guys. Desk, stay stale. Okay, he's definitely a containment kid. Well, when I asked him, he said something like that, which I assume means yes. Just probably a worse one, Ranboo told them. Phil raised an eyebrow. A worse one? He asked, not quite knowing what Ranboo meant. Sure, some containment centers treated the people worse than others. Ranboo's was pretty bad, but they were never really called worse than the other. Ranboo nodded. I showed him my ID card, and when I asked what level he was, trying not to push too hard too fast, he said he didn't know his, Ranboo muttered, shifting uncomfortably. So he can't read? Wilbur asked. Couldn't you just read it for him? No, because he didn't have it. Apparently he hadn't seen it since he was put in the center. He says he only remembers his name on it. They took his card, his ID card, which means he probably wasn't liberated from his center, but rather he escaped, Ranboo explained. So he's probably on the run, Techno finished for him. Ranboo nodded. We'll help him, right? Especially because his containment center still has to be in operation, Tubbo asked. We're not letting him go, even if he doesn't know a lot about himself. No, Tubbo, we were going to help him regardless, but this is much more than we thought. Regular containment centers don't take away cards. This isn't some normal takedown. We'll have to find this place and fast. ID cards are serious, especially if they are a shapeshifter. This could be incredibly dangerous. The boys nodded at the table. If we go into this, we're going to need a full team and more information from Tommy, Wilbur said. We're going to need everything from Tommy, Techno amended his twin statement. We'll need location, amount of people, contained, and workers, plus power list if he can remember. Let's not overwhelm him, Tubbo exclaimed. He's a kid and he's been through something traumatic. Not only will it be difficult for him to remember this stuff, he may have blocked it out too, as trauma response. Not to mention, we'll need to gain his trust first. He won't tell us anything unless he trusts us. I'm with Tubbo. Containment centers are rough on the brain. If he was drugged like I was, he will barely remember the people who worked there, let alone anyone he was held with. I was held alone, and I'm pretty sure A and above were held alone. If he's A-level, chances are this is the first long-term interaction he's had in a long time, Ranboo said. He's probably scared and definitely wary. He's willing to stay here, but who knows for how long. Okay, we'll try to get him to open up, at least a little bit. Even if he doesn't want to help, we're going to have to try to find that containment center. It could be the demise of many people, especially if they're just trying to get the ID cards. They could be killing B through S levels, Phil said. We haven't seen the Prophet in a while, Wilbur commented. We haven't seen the Wither either, Techno said. Well, yeah, but it's been longer since the Prophet made an appearance. They're definitely a wild card there. If they're running this place or even one of the people inside, this could be really dangerous, Wilbur told them. I'm not trying to downplay the Wither and all, but it's been almost a year since the Prophet has been gone, and it's not unusual for the Wither to disappear for a while. The Prophet was practically on schedule, but it's been forever. Whatever has happened, it's not good. You're right, Phil told him. It would be much easier for someone like the Prophet to run a containment center, Ranboo had said offhandedly. Their powers would definitely benefit things. Plus, it'd be hard to contain them, with powers like that. Ranboo let out a breath. Just thinking about his fellow S-levels was strange. They were both villains of sorts, although neither had been seen in a while. So we should at least get Tommy's powers for now, Tubbo asked, trying to find a middle ground. The Wither and Prophet were a touchy subject for both Tubbo and Ranboo. S-levels were supposed to stick together whenever they were born in the same lifetime, but these two were dangerous. I think it's best, Phil said. They nodded. I'm going to make dinner. Do you think the gremlin child is hungry? Techno asked, standing up and stretching. Probably. Containment centers don't feed well, and neither do the streets, Ranboo told him. Plus, have you seen how thin he is? He's definitely undernourished, Wilbur said. Techno only shrugged and started pulling food out. Dinner was... Oops, I scrolled. There we go. Dinner was tense, mainly because everyone was beyond mad. Everyone besides Tommy, who was too focused on eating, happily mind you, to notice the atmosphere on the stairs. The new clothes Tommy had dropped lower than his other clothes had, and he had to roll up the sleeves or else it made every task a little bit harder. They weren't mad at Tommy. No, they couldn't be. Not after this. They were definitely not mad at Tommy, but instead the hatred burned for the people who had put him in a containment unit and for the people who worked there. Tommy had too many scars for anyone, let alone for someone his age. He certainly had more than Ronbu had when he got off the containment center. This was something else entirely. Kids were supposed to have scars, sure, on their knees and elbows from tripping and falling, from play fighting, but there were so many, too big, and they were everywhere. Bruises too, many of which were long faded and still present. They had to be bone bruises, judging on the fadeness on them. They assumed his entire body was covered like that, considering many of the scars disappeared under his clothes. There was a considerable burn mark on the inside of Tommy's arm, but he didn't seem to care that they were on display. This was normal for him, meaning everyone at this center must have been like this. Tommy noticed the stares. Sure, it wasn't until after he finished eating that he realized the people in the room kept looking at him, and the atmosphere had changed into something he couldn't recognize. He started fiddling with his fork under the table. It was a little dangerous to do that since he decided to not put on his gloves after the shower. That would be suspicious, but he couldn't help but play with the fork. Tommy, Phil spoke up, and his head shot up. Phil smiled calmly at him, hoping to calm some of his nerves. It would be really helpful for us if you could at least tell us your powers. We don't need the technical name, just anything helps. Just so we know how to start helping. Tommy hesitated, but realized he had been holding his fork for enough time now, so he nodded. I can slowly disintegrate metal, Tommy lied. Technically it wasn't a lie, but it also wasn't the truth. He picked up his fork again and held it tightly in his hand. They watched and waited for about a full minute before the fork bent in his other hand before breaking apart. If I keep holding it, it will turn to ash. Now that was a complete lie. He couldn't turn anything to ash without fire, but he claimed disintegration, so we had to make it believable. Only metal? Tuppo asked, tilting his head. Tommy nodded and picked up a napkin. He held it out for the same amount of time. He knew it wouldn't fall apart. After all, he hadn't held it for nearly as long as he had held the fork. Nothing happened and they accepted it. See, Tommy said, it's slow and only metal objects. He really didn't like lying to the people that were helping him, but he could always tell the truth later. It was dark and Tommy wasn't quite sure where he was going. Although he has memorized his way back, it wasn't too hard for this place. This place is huge and the amount of rooms was insane. Tommy was good at being quiet. It was how he managed to get so far in the compound before anybody realized he was gone. He barely made any noise as he walked down the hallway. He was looking for something that they had to have, even if it wasn't on the floor. He might as well check this floor because there was no way he was going downstairs before morning. The elevator ding was way too loud for his liking. Sure, he probably wouldn't wake everyone up, but there was a chance and Tommy didn't like to take chances that weren't planned out at least a little bit. He had only heard the elevator ding once, so it wasn't nearly enough to actually figure out if it would wake anyone. A dim blue glow caught his attention. Tommy brightened and headed over to the door where the light seeped under. Carefully, he opened the door and peeked inside. It was actually what he was looking for. Computer room. Monitors and keyboards were all over. It was just what he needed. The only reason he actually agreed. Although he really liked the warm, soft clothes, so maybe he'd stay, but only after he found what he needed. He just needed to know, once and for all anyway. Sure, he knew, but it was different to know and assume you were right than to know and to see you were right. He needed to see. And that's the end of Chapter 4 of this fanfic, which is called Sunsets and Freedom. And I forgot that for a minute. Thank you all for listening, and thank you for the comments. I'm sorry for some of you, I cannot translate what that says. And also, I think I need glasses, because my eyesight is really bad right now, and I'm really just guessing what words say, because I cannot read right now. Like, I read that whole thing and my eyes are so blurry. I don't know if it's because I've been staring at a computer screen or that I just need glasses, but it's hilarious to me, and I'm actually really proud that I was able to read this with how blurry my eyes are. But thank you guys for listening. I feel like I could probably handle some more, but it's been about an hour, so I think we should stop, and my voice is dying. So that's where we're gonna end it. Thank you guys. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in 2 days for some more fun. And I kind of don't want to have to wait to do this like once a week. I want to read more. Like, I think once a week is a good schedule, but I also really want to continue reading this story. So I don't know. Either I'll read some more of it off screen, or I'll schedule another stream to read some more really soon. Yeah, we'll see about that. So thank you guys for coming, and have a great rest of your day. Bye. Bye, 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 bye.